"What happened to your face, waitress?" "Get hit with a frying pan." They laughed. She didn't. She simply set the coffee down and turned away, quiet, calm, eyes down. But at table 3, the man in uniform had stopped eating. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and saluted. The whole diner froze because now everyone was staring at her, not with mockery, but with sudden, overwhelming respect. If you believe scars can be metals type, she stood tall. It was a typical Tuesday morning shift at Miller's Family Diner. She moved methodically from table to table like she always did, consistently polite, efficiently professional, maintaining quiet dignity despite the circumstances. Her scars were clearly visible, jagged lines trailing down the left side of her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her standard waitress uniform. The marks were old but prominent, telling a story that most people couldn't comprehend. Most regular customers didn't ask intrusive questions. Some would glance briefly and look away respectfully, understanding that some stories were private. But not this particular group, for middle-aged men in expensive polo shirts and casual cruelty. "Damn," one whispered with deliberate loudness. "She looks like she wrestled with a chainsaw and lost badly." Another added with increasing volume, "At least wear some makeup if you're going to serve food." "Looking like that, sweetheart." She didn't respond to their taunts, just quietly refilled their coffee cups and walked away with professional composure. They snickered among themselves with obvious satisfaction. One mimicked an exaggerated limp as she passed their table, trying to cruelly imitate the way she slightly favored her right leg. "You need help carrying that heavy tray, sweetheart. Or did the blast take your balance along with your looks?" She didn't drop the serving tray despite their harassment. Didn't flinch visibly at their words, just kept moving steadily, Toledo table, maintaining her professional routine. The cruelty escalated as they realized she wouldn't respond defensively. "Maybe she's deaf too," one suggested with false concern. "War zones do that right." "Or maybe she's just embarrassed," another added. "Can't blame her for that face." Their laughter grew louder, drawing uncomfortable glances from other diners who were witnessing the harassment. But no one intervened. No one told them to stop. No one defended her dignity. She continued her work with mechanical precision, refilling water glasses, taking orders, delivering food. Her movements were careful and deliberate, suggesting someone who had learned to adapt to physical limitations. The slight limp they mocked was barely noticeable unless someone was looking for flaws to exploit. Her scarred neck was positioned to minimize visibility, but she didn't hide completely. She had learned to live with the physical reminders of whatever had happened to her. "Bet she was prettier before," one of the harassers continued. "Wonder what happened? Car accident, kitchen fire." "Does it matter?" another I replied. "Point is she shouldn't be scaring customers with that face." Their comments grew more personal and vicious as they fed off each other's cruelty. She maintained her professional demeanor throughout the harassment, never giving them the reaction they seemed to want. Her silence wasn't submission. It was controlled strength that they couldn't recognize. Someone who had survived whatever created those scars possessed resilience that exceeded their understanding. But they interpreted her quiet professionalism as weakness they could exploit for entertainment. The other diners grew increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating harassment. Some looked away in embarrassment. Others frowned with disapproval, but remained silent. The atmosphere in the diner shifted as decent people struggled with whether to intervene. But she didn't seem to need rescue. She seemed to need respect. And that was something none of them understood how to provide until someone who recognized true strength decided to act. Someone who understood that scars could represent service rather than shame. Someone who knew that appearances could deceive, but character never lied. The moment of recognition was approaching that would transform everything about how she was perceived. Not through her words or actions, but through someone else's understanding of what her scars actually represented. At table 3 sat a distinguished older gentleman, silver gray hair, neatly styled, perfectly pressed military dress, jacket, single gold ring on his left hand. He had been there since the diner opened, nursing black coffee, eating scrambled eggs, methodically requesting nothing else from the staff. But when the harassing voices rose to uncomfortable levels, he stopped eating completely. His experienced eyes followed her professional movements, watched her maintain remarkable composure under deliberate cruelty. Then he stood with deliberate purpose. No one noticed his movement initially until the room fell oddly quiet for reasons people couldn't immediately identify. He placed his military cap down carefully on the table, adjusted his shoulders with formal precision, and then he saluted. Full military salute, deliberate and ceremonial, facing directly toward her position. She turned slowly, initially unsure why the atmosphere had changed. Then her eyes met his across the diner, and in that charged moment, everything stopped. The table of mockers went visibly pale with growing comprehension. One whispered with obvious confusion, "Wait, is that officer saluting her?" The waitress took a slow, steady breath. Then, without speaking a word, she returned the salute with perfect military precision. Every veteran customer in the room immediately stood in response. "Ma'am," the colonel said loudly enough for everyone to hear clearly, "it's an honor to see you again." The transformation was instantaneous and profound. The harassment stopped as if a switch had been thrown. The cruel laughter died, completely replaced by stunned silence. People began understanding that they had been witnessing something far more significant than casual workplace mockery. "Colonel Henderson," she replied with quiet respect. "Sir at ease, soldier," he said gently. "You're off duty." The exchange revealed everything the harassers had missed. Her careful movements weren't weakness. They were the result of combat injuries sustained in service. Her scars weren't disfigurement. They were evidence of sacrifice for her country. Her quiet professionalism wasn't submission. It was military discipline maintained in civilian life. The men who had mocked her appearance began understanding they had been taunting a combat veteran, someone whose injuries had been earned protecting others rather than suffered through accident or misfortune. "These gentlemen were just leaving," the colonel said, looking directly at the harassers. It wasn't suggestion. It was a command delivered with unmistakable authority. They fumbled for their wallets, left money on the table, and departed without another word. Their departure left the diner in respectful silence. Other customers watched the interaction with growing understanding and obvious shame for their earlier inaction. She had been serving them breakfast, while carrying physical reminders of service they would never comprehend. And they had allowed her to be treated with disrespect that dishonored not just her, but the value she had defended. The colonel's salute had communicated more effectively than any speech about recognition, respect, and the true meaning of sacrifice. Her scarred appearance had been refrained from something to mock into something to honor. The physical limitations that had been ridiculed were now understood as evidence of courage under fire. Her quiet dignity was revealed as strength rather than weakness. "Would you join me for coffee?" the colonel asked. "When your shift ends." "Yes, sir," she replied. "I'd like that." The room remained silent as she returned to her work. But everything had changed in the space of a single salute. She was no longer just a waitress with visible scars. She was a veteran who deserved recognition and respect. And everyone present had learned the difference between appearance and character, between civilian assumptions and military reality, between mockery and honor. After the harassing customers left in embarrassed silence, still red-faced and avoiding eye contact, Colonel Henderson remained at his table. He asked respectfully for her time when the shift ended. She agreed without hesitation. They sat together by the large front window as afternoon sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds. He didn't ask probing questions. His experienced eyes already understood her story. She had been deployed in country for 14 grueling months in active combat zones, severely injured while pulling a downed Marine out of a burning transport vehicle that had struck an improvised explosive device. That rescued Marine, his nephew, Staff Sergeant Michael Henderson. "He talks about you like you were a guardian angel," the colonel said with obvious emotion. Silent under fire, just steady hands and determination and incredible strength. "He's the only reason I stayed conscious during the extraction," she whispered. "Kept talking to me, kept me focused." The bureaucratic aftermath had been nearly as traumatic as the combat injury itself. She'd been systematically denied full disability compensation. Critical paperwork had mysteriously gotten lost in administrative processing. Her military file was eventually marked limited operational status and effectively shelved without proper medical evaluation. So she returned to civilian life, took the first employment opportunities she could find that didn't require extensive physical capabilities. "You saved my nephew's life," he said with quiet intensity. "I served my country," she answered simply. "Same as anyone who wore the uniform." The diner manager, who had been discreetly listening from behind the counter, overheard their entire conversation. The next day, her hourly pay was quietly doubled without explanation. A small brass plaque appeared by the cash register, displaying her name and years of military service. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "The Hero Who Served Us Breakfast." But the most significant change was in how people treated her. Regular customers began requesting her section specifically not just for efficient service, but to be in the presence of someone who represented genuine sacrifice. One elderly gentleman left an unmarked envelope on her table. Inside was his Bronze Star medal and a handwritten note reading, "You earned in this more than I ever did." Another veteran customer, a Vietnam-era Marine, started leaving substantial tips with personal notes thanking her for her service. Word spread through the veteran community about the combat hero working at Miller's Family Diner. Military personnel from nearby bases began making pilgrimages to meet her and express gratitude. But she remained unchanged by the attention. Still polite, still professional, still focused on providing good service to every customer. The recognition didn't alter her fundamental character. It simply allowed others to see what had always been there. Her scars didn't fade with increased respect. The physical limitations didn't disappear with better treatment, but the shame that others had tried to attach to her appearance vanished completely because the people who mattered now saw her correctly, not as someone damaged by combat, but as someone who had chosen to risk everything for others. Her visible injuries became badges of honor rather than sources of embarrassment. Proof that she had been willing to sacrifice her own safety for the protection of fellow service members. The harassment she had endured revealed more about the character of her tormentors than about her own worth. People who mocked veteran service connected injuries demonstrated their own moral failure, while people who recognized sacrifice showed their understanding of true value. Her story became a teaching moment for the entire community about respect, recognition, and the invisible struggles that veterans faced after returning home, and about the importance of looking beyond appearances to understand the person underneath. Regular customers now actively waited for tables in her section, seeking not just efficient coffee service, but the profound presence of someone who embodied genuine sacrifice and quiet strength. One grateful customer left an emotional unveil on her table. Inside was his father's Purple Heart medal and the heartfelt words, "You earned this honor more than anyone I've ever known." Her physical scars didn't fade with increased recognition. The visible reminders of combat remained exactly the same. But the social shame that cruel strangers had tried to attach to her appearance vanished completely and permanently, because the people who truly mattered now saw her through the correct lens of honor rather than pity. And every Sunday morning, without fail, Table 3 remained officially reserved. Not specifically for Colonel Henderson, though he visited regularly, but for anyone who needed to sit across from authentic strength and be reminded what grace under pressure really looked like. Military families made special trips to meet the woman who had saved their loved ones. Combat veterans found comfort in sharing space with someone who understood their struggles without requiring explanations. Civilian customers learned to recognize service and sacrifice that extended far beyond their personal experience. The diner's atmosphere transformed from casual indifference to respectful appreciation. Staff members took pride in working alongside someone whose character elevated their entire establishment. Management implemented a zero-tolerance policy for harassment of any kind, but especially toward veterans. The local military community adopted Miller's Family Diner as an unofficial gathering place where service members knew they would be welcomed and respected. She became an unwitting symbol of resilience and dignity that inspired others facing their own challenges. People dealing with visible disabilities found courage in her example of refusing to hide from public scrutiny. Veterans struggling with reintegration into civilian life saw that productive, meaningful work was possible despite physical limitations. Young people learned that heroism often appeared ordinary until circumstances revealed extraordinary character. Her story spread beyond the local community through social media and veteran networks. But fame didn't change her fundamental approach to life and work. She continued arriving early, staying late, treating every customer with professional courtesy, regardless of their treatment of her. The recognition was gratifying, but service remained her primary motivation. She had found purpose in civilian life that honored her military values while contributing to her community. The breakfast shift at a small-town diner became her new mission. Not glamorous or highly compensated, but meaningful work that provided dignity and independence. Her example influenced policy changes at Veteran Affairs offices throughout the region. Administrators began examining how bureaucratic failures had allowed a combat hero to struggle without proper support. Medical evaluation procedures were improved to prevent qualified veterans from falling through administrative cracks. Disability compensation processes were streamlined to reduce delays that forced wounded warriors into inappropriate civilian employment. Her individual case became a catalyst for systemic improvements that helped thousands of other veterans. But she remained focused on the daily work that sustained her rather than policy advocacy that might consume her energy. Years later, military leadership training programs would study her story as an example of maintaining dignity under adversity. Students would learn that true strength often appeared as quiet professionalism rather than dramatic heroics. That service continued in civilian life through different means, but with the same fundamental commitment to others. That recognition was important, but service itself was the ultimate reward. Her legacy lived not in the newspaper articles or ceremonial honors, but in the changed lives of people who encountered genuine heroism in an unexpected setting. If you believe dignity doesn't need to raise his voice, subscribe to The Ordinary Heroes.